A very good evening, everyone. This is Mukuta, tuning from Delhi NCR, and I'm from Shada University. Along with me, Namrata is there. She is tuning from Guwahati. And we are very, very delighted to introduce our keynote speaker. She is Preeti Gill ma'am. And I'm going to introduce Preeti Gill ma'am before you. Preeti Gill ma'am is an independent literary agent who has more than 20 years of experience in the publishing industry as a commissioning editor and rights director. She has traveled extensively in the northeast of India and written on issues of conflict and women. She is the editor of the Peripheral Center, Voices from India's Northeast, as well as Bearing Witness, a report on the impact of conflict on women in Nagaland and Assam. Her writing has appeared in numerous journals and anthologies, including 1984 in Memory and Imagination, which was published in 2016. Her documentary Rambuai, Mizoram's Troubled Years, which was co-produced with Sanjay Hazaraka sir, and it was released in September 2016. She has edited She Stoops to Kill, an anthology of murder stories by women, as well as insider, outsider, belonging and unbelonging in India's Northeast. And both of these books were published in the year 2019. So Preeti Gill ma'am has built up an eclectic list of women writers from the Northeast when she worked as the commissioning editor of Juban, a feminist publishing house based in Delhi. As an independent literary agent, she represents many of the best known, most respected, award-winning writers from the region. She spans her time between Delhi and Amritsar, where she has set up a beautiful literary and cultural hub, the first of its kind called Majda House, and which regularly holds literary and cultural events and festivals. Her new forthcoming publication is an edited volume of non-fictional essays on Punjab. Hearty welcome, Preeti ma'am. Thank you for joining. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. And first of all, let me thank the organizers at Sharda University and the School of Humanities and Social Sciences, NEHU, Northeastern Hill University, and CTEF, Meghalaya chapter, for inviting me to speak at this conference on literatures from India's Northeast. I'd also like to give a special thank you to Mukuta Bora from the Department of English for her warmth and her help and this excessively long bio that she's just read out to you. What I'd like to talk to you about today, and I'm going to veer off the brief that has been given to me a little bit. I'll talk about my long years of travel and work in the region called the Northeast, and also share some of my experiences of publishing some of the most well-known and respected writers from there. The hills and valleys of the Northeast are beautiful, and it never ceases to amaze me how green and rain-soaked they are. Growing up in Madhya Pradesh, in the very heartland of this country, I never saw anything that looked like that landscape. And traveling through lush forests full of dripping creepers and green ferns hanging from the hillsides and from rocks, that was a sight so wondrous that I was entranced on my very first trip to Assam and then to Nagaland some 25 years ago. I knew nothing about these places or about the people who lived there. I knew nothing about curfews or martial law or gun battles and insurgencies. As Indians, we are bound together by the territorial limits of a nation that has struggled to contain us, but not much else. For the ignorance, the difference, Disparities and disjuncts are just too huge. In all my growing up years in Bhopal and then later in Mussoorie, I had read nothing about the conflicted history of these faraway lands. They did not feature in my textbooks or even in the newspapers. In fact, nothing I read prepared me for what I will call the violence of normal times, where the many disparate histories of my country have been lost, forgotten, or silenced. The term the Northeast is a geographical, linguistic, and ethnic stereotyping that clubs together eight very disparate. I think I did something there. It's gone to the side. I don't know. Ethnic stereotyping that clubs together eight very disparate, diverse, often misconstrued and misunderstood states that lie in the northeastern periphery of the Indian Union. In no local language does such a term exist that lumps together an entire region, a region comprising distinct states with their own languages, cultures, religions, traditions, histories. A region where over 255 tribes and their history, their memory, their land were violently clubbed together into a fictional region for political convenience, administrative ease, and the purpose of surveilling the border regions. From the matrilineal society of Meghalaya to the patriarchal traditions of Assam, from the Lai Haroba and Ras Leela of Manipur to the Chirao of Mizoram, from the Matsu and Hornbill festivals of Nagaland to the Gompas of Arunachal, each state is a storehouse of a wealth of traditions, customs, and artistic forms that are as lush and as abundant as the landscape that originated them. And all of these coexist with modernity and its influences, the acceptance of new religions, new political and social structures. To say that the northeastern states are different from the rest of the country in almost every way is to state the obvious. But it's important in that it requires us to recognize that these differences have created rifts, giving rise to local insurgencies, demands for secession from the Indian state, and to years of internal conflict and simmering discontent. It's also important, I think, to recognize that this region is different from the rest of the country in a way that is inevitable in border areas, taking us back to arguments made by scholars and academics, writers and activists, that locating a region by placing oneself at a point central to oneself is an arrogant and potentially dangerous stance, which is what New Delhi has often been accused of doing. However, meeting people across the states of the Northeast has been, for me, a rewarding experience. The stories I heard over these years of travel and work exposed me to a world that is still largely unknown and somewhat misunderstood, even ignored, by the rest of the so-called mainland. Despite the fact that much has changed in these last 25 odd years, and many more young people are traveling away from their homes to study and earn in India's metros, making visible their stories and their food, their customs, their music, poetry, songs to the rest of the country, all too often they still have to deal with the outsider tag, bringing with it racist attacks and insults. I've often been asked, what am I doing in the Northeast since I don't belong there? In fact, it's the only place where I've been called an Indian in India. Do I need to be born there to belong? Is it not enough that I love the region? I have read a great deal about it. I have many friends there. I love the food. I love the music, the poetry, the weaves. But since I do not belong to the region, my gaze is definitely that of the outsider. And far from being apologetic about it, on the contrary, I feel that, and I feel this very strongly, that many more outsiders should travel there and should engage with issues and make their voices and opinions heard. Like I said, when I first went to Nagaland more than 25 years back, I met a number of people whose lives had been impacted and changed irrevocably by the decades of violence that had gripped their homeland. Each family, every individual had stories to tell of personal loss, of bereavement, of physical and emotional trauma. And for many of them, this was the very first time that someone from another part of India had visited their villages and had sat among them and had listened to them. And when I listened to their stories, I was horrified. because all of those years when I had been in school and in college in Delhi and all through the 60s and the 70s, the Indian state had been waging war against its own people. And I had no idea, none of us did, because that was a time before TV had entered our drawing rooms and much before internet and mobile telephones had taken control of our lives. What surprises me, pains me even, is that even now, so many years later, these are still stories that the average person living in mainland India does not know. And what's worse, does not even care to know. The silencing of these voices on the margins has been complete and deafening. For me, it became imperative that I find a way to talk about this, to find strong local writers whose writing, fiction, non-fiction, poetry would bring these stories out. And right from that first visit to Assam and later Nagaland, Mizoram, Meghalaya, Manipur, etc., I found a treasure trove of strong writing from each state that told of a world far removed, but that helped open a window, telling us stories and recounting histories that had not been heard by an English reading audience. Indira Goswami, Temsela Au, Eastering Kire, Avinu Kire, Mitra Phukan, Arupa Patangia Kalita, Rita Chaudhary, Tilotama Mishra, Binodini Devi, Irom Sharmila, and so many others. These were among the first writers that I helped to publish. Translations at the time were few and far between, and I was working at Kali for Women and then later at Zuban, an offshoot of Kali at the time. And I'm glad that we were able to build this list of women writers from the Northeast. For me, it was an effort to build bridges between communities, help to open up a little known region and an alienated people. It worked as a retelling of local histories and as crucial documentation of a people, and even more importantly, it was also building a multi-layered history of India. Today, I think this is even more critical in order to understand my country, to make sense of the ongoing violence against smaller marginalized communities or what are perceived as marginalized, the debates around nationalism, citizenship, the unanswered questions about who belongs and who does not, and why we need a national register of citizens or the Citizen Amendment Act, Citizen Amendment Law now, because these are the contentious issues that increasingly plague the nation and its people, and it creates divisions and even more fissures. Publishing these writers also worked as political intervention. Conflict writing or literature that has grown out of violent fractures in a country's history, like the 1947 partition or Mumbai, are all integral part of keeping that history alive, of passing it down from generation to generation. Something I heard often in Mizoram during the course of research for a film on the MNF was, no one has bothered to ask us what we lived through and what we lost or what we want. I have not told my children, grandchildren, or their children anything. They will grow up not knowing their past, their history of displacement and loss. Almost all the states of the Northeast were besieged by years of insecurity and violence, death, kidnapping, rape, torture on a daily basis. This, coupled with the government's apathy, corruption, poverty, and unemployment, has been the troubling reality for most ordinary people caught in this crossfire between armed insurgents or non-state actors and the government's counterinsurgency operations. This strain of violence and death, so much a part of their daily lives, has found a reflection in much of the literature that comes from this region. Writers and poets from the region dealt with these themes in terrifying imagery and detail. Fear, reprisals, rape of innocence, death, torture haunt the landscape of these writers. Stories of common people confronted and caught up in uncommon circumstances has been an oft-seen theme. The endemic violence of the times, where the writers themselves have grown up in the shadow of the gun, has suffused the works of even younger writers like Aruni Kashyap, Janice Parrier to Deepana Goswamini to Das. And despite the generational change visible in their writing, their desire to analyze the common people's reaction to insurgency is as strong as ever. To bear witness, to document the upheavals and the havoc caused by events larger than oneself, is troubling and painful, but it has many powerful lessons of resilience and coping with stress and violence. Their fiction often reflected the cold reality that I found in the interviews and reports I read as I traveled in Nagaland and Assam during the course of studies on conflict and its effect on women and children. Listening to villagers in remote corners of these states talk about their ordeal at the hands of security personnel, I met so many people whose lives had been completely changed by these decades of violence. And I believed then that the telling of these stories could work as a form of catharsis, as well as a positive intervention and empowerment, building bridges between communities. Today, much older and somewhat wiser, I cannot really say whether this is true. I don't know if anyone can bear witness, can help to heal the devastating effects of conflict. The deep impact on a society's culture, memory, songs, folk tales, on individuals who survive is not easy to come to terms with. As one of the most gentle and yet powerful voices from the region, Mamang Dai said, yes, there is writing about guns and bullets and deaths and betrayal. It can hardly be otherwise when we are confronted with changes that bring such terror and anguish. I remember this young woman whom I'd met in Dimapur. She was the member of the women's ho-ho there, and she shared her own experiences with me when I met her. Her village, she said, was bombed by the Indian Air Force in the 1960s. She was only a baby at the time, but she remembers that her mother, who was running away from the burning village, hid her in the hollow of a tree, thinking that, she'd take her out when she returned and she would come back when it was safe. It was 3 days before the mother managed to come back, and the child lay inside that hollow, hungry and frightened and alone. It's unimaginable. I can't even believe that something like this could happen. And I know that I was totally shocked when I heard this story. But so many stories like this find themselves in anthologies, thinly disguised as fiction. Temsula Ao calls her collection, These Hills Called Home, a work of memory. The Naga people's shared collective memory of what they lost, as opposed to the national narrative, where Nagaland is victoriously referenced to having become an Indian state in December 1963. The history of the Nagas has turned into folklore, passed down from generation to generation through the oral tradition of storytelling. Their stories form an organic whole of the terror that gripped the entire populace of the state when India's feverish nation building efforts shattered the peace of the hills and the cultural aspirations of an entire people. In order to subvert the national narrative, we need alternative accounts of history told by those who lived it and suffered it, the people whose lives were destroyed, uprooted, disfigured by events that took away their loved ones, their cultural moorings, their land, and all these familiar spaces, which were lost to them so completely that it will only remained in the memory of some older members. Award-winning writer from Nagaland, Easterine Kire, says she's constantly mining the memory of her clan, her community, her family, her people to create her haunting novels and stories. Survival is often the centerpiece of her writing, where she juxtaposes devastation and loss with joy and hope. Even death and unimaginable horror is framed with tenderness and love, because that is the truth. Her prose shines with the memories of her clan and the Naga people and her own personal observations, creating for us a truth that is gut-wrenching as she describes the armed movement of the Naga underground and melds together rich tapestry of her people's folk tales and myths, songs and belief systems to provide us with a unique worldview. Well-known writer from Assam, Mitra Phukan, does the same thing when she places her protagonist against the backdrop of violent happenings, as she did in her first novel, when she talked about love and loss in the time of insurgency, in the time of the Assam agitation. So is this a burden that the writers from the region carry? Is this what is expected of them? That they describe only the conflict and the violence, the death that they see around them? Author, translator, poet Aruni Kashyap says that he did feel the pressure, especially from readers outside Assam, because they expected him to write about insurgency and violence. But then he says that the readers in Assam accused him of selling violence. Sahitya Academy winning Assamese author Arupa Patangia Kalita, however, says that living in Assam, one can hardly ignore these realities, especially when one is a politically conscious writer. Her roots in Assam have influenced her writing, and she has used the rich folk tradition of her state, its natural beauty, its rich traditions, to tell the story of its political turmoil. What makes the writing of the Northeast so special to me is this very specificity. The rush of excellent literary fiction from here brings to me folklore, oral narratives, stories of insurgency, the clash of modern and traditional value systems, a certain physical and even psychological disconnect with the rest of the world that is familiar to me. And I find this fascinating. Does literature, especially that which is so closely based on real life or reportage, work as historical documentation? I think that it does. It is a unique feature of poetry and writing that it can add layers of emotion, shade, and density of meaning, especially to information about places that have faced such fracturing. If you read poets Robin Nangom, Isturin Kire, Nitu Das, Monazote, Kinfam, Singnongbre, Shalim Hussain, and various others, it's apparent that what binds them and their poetry is a certain rootedness, the roots of the beloved land, the roots of their people's culture, and most of all, the roots of a past that is lost to them. Personally, for me, the writings that have come out of the 1947 partition are particularly significant and evocative. 73 years later, we still bear the scars of that partitioning. The stories and the songs of that other land where my mother and her mother came from have become mine. The names of those villages and towns beat in my blood, even though I've never visited them. When my mother's family left Ahmedabad in August 1947 and reached Bar Camp, somewhere between Peshawar and Rawalpindi, and then came to the newly minted Indian border, they brought with them a host of stories of the land that they had once called their own. They thought they'd return after all the bloodletting was over, covering furniture carefully, leaving keys with helpful neighbors and friends, exchanging letters for years afterwards, till it finally became clear that there would be no going back, that this parting was final. Is this the reason that the Northeast, with its myriad insider-outsider stories, attracted me? Because in our case too, it was an arbitrary line drawn by a colonial mapper who had never been to India and had very little knowledge of the vast subcontinent that he was asked to partition, who took away my family's homeland, and who changed our destinies forever. Not everyone has rejoiced in these new freedoms. They didn't at that time, and they don't now, when new lines are drawn and people are forced to live with the consequences of that. So just as today, there are questions around our identity, our nationalism, our patriotism, should we not also question our idea of what India is and what it is in danger of becoming? When you're forced to leave, you not only lose the land your ancestors lived in, you lose a part of them as well. With every act of migration, you lose a little bit of your own history. You leave your dead behind, you leave their graves, you leave the streets that they walked on and the ground that they once trod upon. This happened with my family. This happened with everyone forced to regroup into different villages after the forces came in many of the states in the Northeast. And it happened to everyone who ran away to escape from marauders who burnt their huts and villages. Mitra Phukan described this in her essay about a music teacher who once lived in Shillong. And she says, in that essay, she writes, he had lived in this place for more than a quarter of a century, yet he felt that this was now an alien land. The land of his birth, too, was a place to which he was an outsider now. He needed a passport to go there. Is this the unfinished business of partition playing out? Are we still in search of our identities? Is it necessary that our identities be carved out of so much hatred and so much violence? Aruni says it in one of his interviews that the Northeast has always had an iffy relationship with the idea of India. And in his poetry and in his fiction, he talks about Assam and its realities, about the political agitations, about ethnic violence. He calls himself an Assamese writer, and he writes both in English and in Ahomia. Echoing this, Arupa Patangya Kalita asks, what do I write? I write what I see around me, about the air I breathe, the water I drink, the rivers I see, the flowers I smell, the folk tradition I grew up in, the history I live. And most writers from the Northeast try to portray and interpret the reality around them. Often they are the voice for the violent histories of common people. For Arupa, writing is a social activity and her effort to understand the dynamics of society. For me as well, the Peripheral Center, Voices from India's Northeast, the first nonfiction anthology that I worked on, was triggered by the encountered killing of Manorama and the naked protests by the elderly women of Manipur. That searing image stayed with me for a long time, alerting me not only to the reality of human rights abuse by security forces in these states, but also to question why it must take something like this for us to wake up and to question what was being done to us. In my long years in publishing, this is something I had learned. If we can hear and read about different cultures through their stories and histories, these faraway people become our neighbors and friends. And in building this list of women writers that I spoke about earlier, I think what I read about was the Assam agitation, the Naga Hills, the years of disquiet, the Mizo Front, the bombing of Aizawl, the beauty of Manipuri theatre, the strength and resilience of the women of Manipur and of all these other states. And I read so much more, and it acquainted me and brought all of these things into my world. The other thing that always struck me was that the world came to the Northeast through the tea trade and the World War. But this is a fact that is hardly talked about. So much of that history has been silenced and it's been buried away. Why is that? And because you mentioned that I now live in Amritsar, let me bring in a little bit of what I do now as well. I live in Amritsar most of the time, and because Punjab and the farmers' agitation is taking up so much of my own headspace, I do want to point to this as another example of falling off the map. This is the largest farmers' agitation since independence, and yet we don't want to talk about it. It pains me when I see the false perceptions that are being created, that the protesting farmers are Khalistani terrorists and Maoists, and I feel that this is not only damaging, it's also very dangerous. I also mention this here because I see similarities, or I am beginning to see all the similarities with what has happened to that corner of the country that we call the Northeast. There are vulnerable, hostile borders. There's a lack of infrastructure. There's a lack of heavy industry. And there's a growing feeling of peripheralization because of low political representation, perhaps. There's also a feeling that maybe our concerns don't really matter. After setting up Maja House in Amritsar, and as mentioned earlier, it's a literary space that encourages the free flow of ideas and of discussion and debate. I have tried to build networks between the Northeast and the Northwest by regular exchanges, both physical and online, with writers and performers, poets and researchers. And we've done a couple of research projects too. To me, this is true connectivity, for it connects you to people who may be far away in terms of geographical distance, but their stories ring true when they are even if they are completely outside the realm of your own imagination. To know a people, to understand them, it's very important to listen to what they are saying. If you know what their dreams are and what their stories are, what the history of their communities is, then maybe that faceless other can become a real person, a neighbor, and a friend. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Preeti ma'am. You make all of us emotional. And we have Sanjay Hazaraka sir here, Mitra here. Uh, any questions for Preeti Gill ma'am?
Not really. She's said it all. I think she's covered the space remarkably and with both depth, sweep, and space. So it was, yeah, it was quite a journey.
Thank you.
Over to you, Namrata.
I can see Mitra there. Mitra, do you want to ask a question to Preeti ma'am?
Yeah, please. No, not a question, just a comment.
All
right. It's been a really wonderful journey, Preeti. You have taken us on, and yeah, it's an outsider's gaze, but much more than that, it's the insider's gaze as well. So I don't think anybody else could have done this melding together the way you have done. And you've covered a huge amount of ground, literary as well as historical, conflict, everything. So thank you for that. That was really good.
Thanks, Mitra. Thank you.
There are some comments from the guest. Dr. Pyle has written, Preeti ma'am, it was wonderful listening to you. And Rasmi Mania Sirot, very emotional, ma'am. Honestly, you make us very, very emotional, ma'am. And thank you very much for joining and accepting our invitation. It was great pleasure listening to you.
Thank you, Mitra. Thank you.
Yeah, Preeti ma'am, thank you so much for your thought-provoking talk. Actually, I was just thinking like how splendidly you install different kinds of window views for each one of us. And we can just steal a glimpse, no? We can just have snippets of the Northeastern terrain, which is diverse and of course, like it has variegated experiences. But at the same time, let me tell you that your talk is also about a kind of political assessment. And you expose the fault lines. And very deftly, you talked about the flux, the constant malleability of terms like insider and outsider, right? It's always about crossing the border. The moment you are an insider in a particular terrain, but the moment you cross the border, you transform into the other. So the way we create others, what goes into the process of otherization? How do we actually put a person in the fringes, label him as a subaltern, as a downtrodden, as a peripheral figure? And what kind of political nuances go into the process of otherization? So that's very, very lucidly portrayed in your writings. Also, you talked about that in a very, very smooth fashion today, Preeti ma'am. Before I wind up the session, let me tell you that our participants, most of them are students, and they have a rich pedagogical experience of going through your text in the classroom, because when we take up the primary writers, so we always do it in the context of the other critical materials that are available at hand. Very commendable work, Preeti ma'am. And then again, documentation, representation, writing about a community. So of course, these are self-fashioned individual manifestations, but at the same time, they can be objective. The moment you tell a story, you have to think about how it is going to be received. The moment you tell a story in a scenario of administrative high-handedness, the moment you tell a story about violence, the moment you document a story of counterinsurgency and the extremist movements, of course, you are not standing on a neutral terrain. It's value-laden, and at the same time, it's fascinating. It's also about how you connect to the mass, and it's also about how you distance yourself from the mass. Thank you so much, Preeti ma'am, for enlightening us with your thought-provoking talk.
Thanks very much, Namrata. Thank you for all your lovely comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
So, so shall we begin our first panel, ma'am? Preeti ma'am, you were staying back, right? You were.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, It's indeed a great privilege to introduce three outstanding authors from Assam for our panel one. And as you see from the title, it talks about the writer as public literati and a mediator of change. So we'll get a chance to know their creative process, their mind, their thought process, as they are able to actually produce beautiful novels, short stories. And as we get into the session, we'll put questions to each one of them. So I will be introducing beautiful Mitra Phukan Baidu. So welcome, Baidu.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
So Mitra Phukan is a writer, translator, columnist, and trained classical vocalist who lives in Guwahati, Assam. Her published literary works include 4 children books, a biography, and the novels are The Collector's Wife and A Monsoon Music. She has a collection of 50 of her columns, Guwahati Gauge, and her latest works are a translation of a novel, Blossoms in the Graveyard, and a collection of her own short stories, A Full Night's Reverie. Her fortnightly column, All Things Considered, in the Assam Tribune is very widely read. So she is an active member of Aradhana, an organization that takes music to the underprivileged sections of society, and she is a founder member of the Northeast Writers Forum. Her latest works are Aghonibai and Other Stories, that was published in 2019, and Patmugi and Other Stories, that was published by Assam Sahitya Sabha. It was joint work with Gayatri Bhattacharya, that was published in 2021, recent publication. So I would request Namrata to introduce Kaushik Barua and also Dhruba Hazaraka. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. Over to you, Namrata.
Yes, thank you, Mukuta. We have with us an eminent writer from the Northeast, Dhruba Hazaraka. He is the founder secretary of the Northeast Writers Forum, established in the year 1997. His short stories have been published in various newspapers, including the Sentinel and the Telegraph. A collection of his short stories, Luck, was published in the year 2010 by Penguin. Hazarika's first novel, A Bowstring Winter, was published by Penguin in 2006. His second novel, Sons of Brahma, also by Penguin, was published in the year 2014. Dhruba Hazaraka is a recipient of the Katha Award for Fiction in the year 1996. We also have Kaushik Barua with us. As all of us we know, he is the winner of the Sahitya Akademi Yuba Purashkar for his first book, Windhorse, published by HarperCollins in the year 2013. He graduated in economics from St. Stephen's College in New Delhi and subsequently studied international politics and economics at the London School of Economics. His latest novel is No Direction, Rome, which is a dark comedy with loaded narratives. Welcome to the board, Mitra Baidu, Dhruba and Kaushik.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah. Hi.
Hello.
Yeah, I can see actually. Yeah, it's nice to meet, like it's nice to meet in this virtual platform. So shall we start?
Yes,
Yes,
of course.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Mukuta, you go ahead.
Yeah. My first question is to Mitra Baidu, actually. And I personally adore her. I follow her. I follow both. I follow Preeti ma'am and Mitra Baidu, and honestly. So this question is, does the author have a social responsibility and ethical duty in regard to community? What's your say? Yeah.
Actually, first of all, let me say I'm so happy to be here with all of you. Thank you so much for having me. As for social responsibility, the author, I think first of all, the author's responsibility is to be true to his sensibility or her sensibility. The author's first responsibility is to be true to one's own individuality. That's what I feel. And this individuality, this sensibility is something that doesn't come, you know, we are influenced in good ways and bad ways, in so many ways. And social pressures, I think, especially if you're a woman, social pressures and so on. So what is my sensibility, what is my individuality, what is my voice, what is my way of looking at life? I think the most difficult thing, I can only speak for myself, is to find out who I am. Okay, having said that, yes, I have to find out who I am, but I do not exist in a vacuum. No writer does. And those days when one could say you live in an ivory tower and just write, I don't think that ever worked. Whether you are a poet or a fiction writer or whatever, it never worked. But I think a writer of whatever genre has to be completely in touch with the world around her, so that she can see, and you know, because she has this sensibility, a very carefully built sensibility. For that, I think her reactions or the way she sees the world around her, that becomes what comes out in her writings. You cannot, I mean, it is, as Preeti said, it is a question of bearing witness, but it is also more than that, because it is bearing witness through your eyes, and you can have many kinds of people bearing witness, and these all contribute to the tapestry of what is happening around us. The entire picture is there. So yes, one does have every writer, every person, in fact, does have a responsibility, and that is responsibility to one's own individual voice, and also through that to society. And having said that, you know, we have always thought of, there has been this huge I mean, in the past, poets and fiction writers, mostly poets, they were thought of as seers, prophets, people who could say, people who knew more, people who could take a society forward. I don't really know whether that holds true or if it was ever true. But it is certainly a point of view that writers are trying to give as authentically as possible. It doesn't matter whether you are writing in a realistic way or in a more magic realistic way. It does not matter. It is a point of view you are giving, and it is yes, a mirror also, but a mirror that you are holding up, the author is holding up, the writer poet is holding up. So I think it's both these things, Mukuta. It is also the society as well as the writer, which are completely intermingled. That is how I think of it.
Thank you so much. Dhrubada, am I audible to you? Dhrubada, okay.
He has to unmute.
Dhruba, yeah, you have to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Let's see. This is how intelligent I am with these things are concerned.
So, can you, yeah.
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Yeah. So you want to add something, Dhrubada? The same question. Does the author, yeah, the same question that I have asked Mitra Vaido?
Well, I think she's spoken well enough,
yeah.
and there's nothing much to that I can add. But I feel that the kind of a fiction writer, the kind of writing basically I do anyway. It's the important thing is to stick to a story and to make the writer himself happy first, and thereafter the reader, if it's possible at all. And about the social responsibility, it depends on the theme that you're at. And if the theme is such that it actually focuses on social issues, for example, Mahasatwa Devi's books I can immediately think of.
Yes.
Or let's say Uncle Tom's Cabin way back, then yes. But if it's just a sheer storyline that we're thinking about, and where the social aspects are less, and the aspect of being thrilled with literature, with the poetic turn of a phrase, etc., these then may perhaps not be as important for delving to social and sensibilities. But then, of course, this is a very, in a very broad way I'm talking about. It's not so easy, like Mitra Phukan said, we cannot be in an ivory tower anymore. Those days are gone. So I think, yes, I think for a start, that is what I'm saying right now.
Thank you, Dhruva. Kaushik, yeah.
Thank you, and thanks a lot for inviting me. I mean, I'm really pleased to be here and with people who are so accomplished and have produced so much more. So I think we've heard, and thanks to Preeti for an excellent introductory keynote address that sort of laid out the politics, the history, and the context in which we write. I mean, there's very little that we can add to that, frankly, in our discussion. So I guess all we can do is sort of add our personal opinions on some of these questions.
Yes.
I mean, whether a writer has a responsibility to a community. I mean, I would echo what Mitra Phukan said, what Mitra said, which is that I believe we don't have. I mean, I personally think I don't have a responsibility or obligation to a community, and I'll elaborate on why. I think my first responsibility as a writer is to the story I'm creating. And if the story is based on, real life narratives and real personal narratives, then my responsibility is to the people whose stories I'm building on or I'm depicting. Like in Windhorse, I was depicting, it was a fictionalized account of the Tibetan resistance movement. So my obligation was to that community, but more specifically to the individuals who were involved in the story. And of course, in different forms of fiction, one has a responsibility to one's characters. It's as a fiction writer, I mean, our greatest burden and our greatest privilege is to breathe life into a character. There's some alchemy that happens in the process of writing, which I can't explain, and which I don't think I've achieved well enough yet. But I want to achieve well as I write more. And it's to breathe life into a character, and that happens if you really empathize with and understand your character, whether they are, fictional or built on real life. Even fictional characters are, of course, a hybrid of your own experiences and stories that you pick up. So I don't remember which writer, but someone much wiser than me had said, all autobiography is fiction and all fiction is autobiographical. So the two are, so I don't distinguish between the two as easily, like fiction and non-fiction, but in all writing, we have to be true to the characters we're trying to depict. Whether we should have a sense of responsibility to our community, that depends on which community you're referring to. I mean, does it mean your own community? In which case, there's a risk of being clannish, or does responsibility to your community mean that you are expected to show loyalty or alignment with the dominant norms in your community? Then it could actually be a double-edged sword, this sense of social responsibility. So, I mean, we know that, for example, in the Northeast, since the panel is on the Northeast, there's so many fragmented identities. We know that there are tensions because of which even different communities in the region who are traditionally oppressed could also turn oppressor. So it's also important to have a clear-eyed perspective, some sense of distance, and that comes without burdening oneself with a sense of moral responsibility to a community. I think it should be a very individual and personal sense of responsibility that one has. of course, one also has a responsibility to one's reader. But as we know, we don't know who the reader is. And with writing in India and English writing in India, we don't have that many readers anyway. So I don't worry. So we don't have to worry too much. Not to sound cynical, but but the publishing industry has moved more towards commercial fiction, which is not a bad thing. At least more people are reading. So I mean, perhaps one should think first of oneself, then of the reader. One should have a moral, a sense of moral commitment to some values, but they should be individually owned, not beholden to a community. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kaushik.
Thank you.
Namrata, yeah.
Yes. Yes, Mitra Baido. Yeah. Do you want to add to this?
Yes, a little bit. I would just like to take this a little forward. Kaushik, that's very well summarized. Yeah, Kaushik, that's really well summarized. And what you said, loyalty to which community, that is very important, because I mean, I have seen many Assamese writers, including Orupa, who's coming on tomorrow, and some of the writings of all of us is, especially me, during the Assam agitation, or since my novel was mentioned, things that were put there were not the thoughts that were prevalent at that time, because non-violence was something that really I believe in, and there will be conflicts, but it can be resolved in ways that do not kill. But somehow at that time, a lot of people, I think Dhruba or Preeti, you all will, and Sanjoy will be able to bear me out, believed that violence was a means to an end. And in my novel, I said it was not a means to an end. And I got flack for that. It was as though I was, not being loyal to my own community, but I was being loyal to my sense of humanity or whatever. And it's very much there in Orupa's writings also. It is very strong in Orupa's writings, as well as, Nirupama Borgohain and, of course, Indira Goswami, where she talks about the widows of Vrindavan and so on, which is accepted. It's socially accepted. But she has written it in such a way that it is from the larger perspective of humanity. So Kaushik, very well put, and I completely agree with you.
Thank you, Mitra Baido. Yeah.
I have a question for you, Mitra Baido.
Oh dear.
This is my personal observation, because we have your text prescribed in the syllabus of NEHO. I have observed that some of your writings, actually most of your writings, are speckled with autobiographical elements. So it also means that you have to actually balance, like an acrobatic, you have to do the tiptoeing thing and balancing thing at the same time. So it also means that you have to balance fiction and fact, and you do it poignantly and succinctly. So do you want to throw your insights on your writing process? How do you do that? How do you create that balance between fact and fiction?
Yes, Namrata. See, I believe every writer or every person, we are shaped by things that are happening all around us, things that we read maybe, but mostly our experiences. For me, we are all readers. We have been readers for decades, but it is also the experiences that shape us. And life comes to us. We are immersed in life. We should be immersed in life. And so many things happen all around us. And for me, I can only speak for myself, is because I think in terms of creating characters, I think in terms of creating a plot to take which all fiction writers do. Dhruba also does that. But when it comes to incidents, and perhaps one incident has triggered a story, has triggered a short story maybe, or a series of events has triggered a novel. In Collector's Wife again, the police officer who was killed as he was having dinner, an anniversary dinner with his family, he was killed in full view of people in a restaurant. That actually without exaggeration, it happened to my neighbor. I used to meet him almost every day. He was a lyricist. I used to sing his songs. They went to a dinner, and this is what happened. So how could I not put that in? And it did not need it. I mean, it just came. I did not need to. Of course, imagination is there because I was not present, and nobody. You know how it was. Nobody would speak of these things at that time. There was a silence. There was, and of course, social media was not there. But where people spoke in hushed whispers at that time. Even today, when there is a lot of violence or somewhere, then people tend to not talk about it. Nelly was completely hushed. So these things happen, and those are autobiographical elements, and also things that have happened to me. When I describe grief, when I describe joy, these things, I, like everybody else, I guess, like every other writer, we go within ourselves to describe how we feel, how that has triggered the various emotions, how an incident has triggered various emotions within us, how we deal with it. And then, of course, the question of imagination also comes in, and how you create that, how that is merged into your writing. So what I wanted when I write about the violence and the terror in some of my stories as well as novels, I want to portray the fear more than the incidents. I want to portray the fear, because that fear was very real. It's still very real. When I hear, when somebody I know is going into a place where there has been violence recently, that fear that comes to me, that is what I want to portray. And that is something which I think we all dig deep within ourselves in order to show. So those autobiographical elements are definitely there in my writings, but I think in most writers' writings, though we may, cloak it in other ways, we may put. Yeah, is that all right?
Yeah, go ahead, Baidu. Yeah, so sorry.
Yeah, I'm kind of done.
Okay, thank you so much, Mitra Baidu. Dhruba da.
Yeah, no.
Yeah. Dhruba da, there are very, very interesting points of intersection of the human and non-human planes in your writing, especially luck. Yeah. So we want to hear from you, your own perspectives on that.
Namrata, when you said non-human, I got pretty scared. I began thinking about ghosts and spirits.
Specters and ghosts and apparitions.
Yeah, apparitions. That's a good word.
Yeah.
It's been a long time since I've heard apparitions. But Namrata, I think about the non-human factor, I'm sure you're referring to animals and birds and reptiles.
Yes.
Well, you see, like each of us, we have our own instinctive, our own impulses, compulsions when writing a story. Sometimes certain things come into your mind, into your psyche, over which you have no control. It's simply there. So Mitra Baidu had referred to fear as being one of the themes which he tries to explore. That goes for me too in many ways. But then animals and birds probably came in to my stories without any sort of planning. It came through instinct, because I felt better writing about a bird or a dog or a snake. It happened that way. But it's not as if these stories, the non-human part of it, happened, in a continuous way. It happened over a period of years, and only towards after a period of 10 years or so, you come to know that there's a pattern to the stories, to not all the stories, some of the stories. And no matter how it came about, it's something, it's very difficult to analyze and tell you here on the screen. In fact, I don't even know how it came about. It comes. It's like stories, like they say, a smell triggers it off. a thought triggers it off, an incident triggers it off. But at the base of it, you got to have strong feelings. If the feelings are not sufficiently strong, I think no story can truly be strong. And I've always felt that I mean, my idea of a great story is that, if the story has strong feelings. And well, I'm still groping, Namrata, and I don't think one learns every day, one continues every day with the craft. That's how it is.
Thank you, Dhruba. Thank you so much. Kaushik? Yeah, all right. Kaushik, I mean to say, already shared with you about the rich pedagogical experience that I have in the classroom teaching wind horse. Let me just specify, let me just delve deep into wind horse here. In wind horse, you have amalgamated accurate research, your duty to a particular community, right? That can be your community, or that can be somebody else's community. It's all about your research. It's all about your planning. It's all about your hard work that you have put into it. And the end product is so beautiful. Wind horse is also my personal favorite, right? Because it touches upon the varied interest and experiences of human life. So what is your take on that? And especially being an outsider within quotes, and gazing and looking into a demographic reality or space that is not your own. How did you do that? Creating that magic, in wind horse.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to hear you. I mean, you like wind horse, and I hope the students are enjoying reading and sort of learning from wind horse. But yeah, wind horse, it was written over 5-6 years, and like I alluded in my first response, it was in wind horse I was writing about another community, and that was where my sense of responsibility. I saw my own sense of responsibility. I actually approached wind horse. I stumbled upon the story of wind horse. I mean, in a bookstore in Dharamshala, actually, where I met the person who was the inspiration for the novel. He was an ex-rebel turned poet turned bookstore owner named Lasang Sering, who told me his story and then connected me to other people from the movement, who a lot of sort of senior ex-rebels and who I spoke to and interacted over a period of months. And then I was so fascinated. I mean, I was aware that as an outsider, it was probably contentious and a difficult choice for me to capture and to present such a contentious story. But I decided to go ahead just because it had taken hold of me. I mean, I was kind of obsessed with the story in a sense. But I knew that this was a huge responsibility, and I felt responsible to develop the heft and the authenticity that was needed to bring these characters alive. I spent 5 years almost like an academic, like researching everything I could on the period, on the region. I went through archives in libraries in Delhi, in institutes in Dharamshala. I interviewed dozens of people on the lifestyle, the food, the culture, geography, the beliefs. I mean, the whole sort of world that they inhabited, in a sense, and the world that had been lost to greater political forces. So I spoke to a lot of. I did the sort of let's say archival or secondary research. I also looked at a lot of video footage. That really helped me. I mean, it's much easier now, even 10, 12 years later. But back when I started in 2007-8, I actually got a lot of footage from children of the people who were involved in the resistance movement. And most prominently, this includes the filmmaker Tenzing Sonam and his wife Ritu Sarin, who had collected a lot of footage from that period. So the video footage helped a lot because it gives you a sense of, verisimilitude. You almost, of course, it's never the real thing, but at least it gives you some texture and nuance that you might miss in reading. And I spoke to the younger generation as well, a lot of people that I'm in touch with on what this sense of loss feels like, the loss of a homeland, the loss of a nation. And that informed the writing as well. So that took a good, few years. But frankly, when I'd finished the first draft and the first draft of Windhorse was in 2011. I realized that it was a bit too research heavy. I mean, I had all these finely sort of outlined and detailed accounts of political moments and events, but I had lost the characters in all the research I'd done. I mean, maybe I'd almost mistaken the novel for a PhD thesis, and I realized that it wasn't working. I mean, I'd probably gone overboard. So I actually had a second draft in which, like I said, I realized my first sort of responsibility was to make sure the characters work. So in the second draft, I focused almost entirely on the characters and their personal impulses and their personal motivations, not necessarily the broader political ones. The broader sort of what happened to Tibet and the loss. I mean, that forms the broader narrative, but each character also needs a personal reason to join a struggle. And I tried, and in the second draft, I sort of focused on that. Throughout, I actually, I mean, on the research front, I actually spoke to different people from different regions of Tibet, also because often, especially being from the Northeast, I mean, though it's about a different region, being from the Northeast and being from Assam informed the work, because I know that people often get regional nuances wrong. So I didn't want to, for example, use words that were just the Lhasa dialect. And I wanted to make sure that when I was talking, when characters were speaking in the province Kham, that they would speak in the Khampa dialect, not in the Lasan dialect. And on that, of course, I didn't have first-hand knowledge. I mean, I relied on Mr. Lasang Sering and his advice to get some of those words right. I didn't use too many words. I didn't want to, of course, overplay my hand, though I'd done enough research. So, I mean, when I used them sparingly, I tried to get them right. So I think it was a blend of secondary research, relying on a lot of people who contributed to the novel, especially sort of 3-4 people, Mr. Lasang Sering, there was the poet, Mr. Bojung Sonam. I mean, there are a few who'd read multiple drafts, in fact. So I'm very grateful to them. And then the fact that I just sort of got carried away with the story and carried on.
Thank you. Over to you, Mukuta.
Yeah, thank you, Kaushik. My question is for Dhruba. I have observed that, not me, all of us actually, home has been a constant theme in almost all of your writings. Coming home, arriving, moving away, finding a home. So, you create a homeland in all its manifestations. Would you like to speak on it, Dhruba?
Mukuta, the homeland, yeah, nothing like a home, nothing like a comfortable bed and a good breakfast and, loving people all around you. These are difficult questions, in the sense that, I'm not very sure about myself, how all these things come about. Listening to Kaushik here, his brilliant articulation and the way he has gone about it, I feel very inadequate. I mean, in telling you how to go this aspect of the psychoanalysis about the theme and homeland as a theme. But I have always felt that the ultimate warmth that one can receive is in one's home. And in one of my novels, I had written that, for birds, for example, the whole world is a home. They have no boundaries. There are no geographical boundaries. The sky is the limit, and they can travel wherever they want. But we are constrained by, our territorial homelands, our individual homelands. That this is my boundary. That I'm in an apartment beyond which I can't think it's home. So somehow it is concretized. It is made to feel, one is made to feel that there are boundaries all over, which is something I've always rebelled against. I felt that since I, like most people, have a sense of freedom-loving people, and most writers love freedom, which is one way out of this is through the imagination. I felt that homeland, one's home, ought to be there everywhere. And in case you don't have it, the least you can do is share your feelings, extend to as many people as possible, if you're lucky enough, to tell them that the warmth that a writer generally is supposed to have is the kind of home he would want to have all his life. and which he wants to share or she wants to share with others. Mukuta, I think that's how I can sum it up right now.
Thank you so much, Dhruva. Uh, it's for Mitra Vaido. So you have translated Birendra Kumar Bhattacharya's Gyanpith book, Kabor Aruful, I think, and that has translated into Blossoms in the Graveyard. So please tell us about your experience as a translator, because, yeah.
Yeah. So translation is something that I have come into. I mean, I have been doing it for many years now, but later than writing my own. And I find it really rewarding these days. And especially when I am handed a book like Birendra Bhattacharya's Kabor Aruful, because he has always been, I mean, he's a Gyanpith awardee. So, but even before that, I was translating shorter stories and smaller novels and so on. So that, talking of just that book, actually as a translator, it is, of course, one needs multiple readings, so many things. We all know, I'm not going to go into that. But also, I think the first and second reading is about the tone of the story. The tone of the story and the emotion that informs that story. This story, Kabor Aruful, it's actually about the Bangladesh War of Liberation, which immediately resonated with me because for an Assamese writer to speak with so much empathy about things that happened at that time in a different country. And also then he used this device of Meher, the protagonist. She is a young girl who progressively loses everything. She loses her family, she loses her village, she loses her friend, her significant other, and she loses her sense of who she is. She's raped. So she, and yet she survives, yet, right at the end, because there's this phrase is there, Allah more kununai, I have nobody. And she tries to rely on religion, and she realizes at the end that even religion will fail her. Finally, she says, Moyasu, I can rely on myself. It is me that I am relying on. So that journey, parallel journeys of a nation being born, of a nation and a people being reborn, and also a girl who is, after having lost everything, she is now reborn and she has created her own identity. That really resonated with me, but also the fact that there was so much empathy, there was so much humanity in what he said. And Birendra Bhattacharya has always been very careful not to demonize anybody. If he shows a soldier from Pakistan raping Meher, he's also showing somebody who has protected her, another soldier from Pakistan who has protected her. So that humanity, that balance really appealed to me. And I was very grateful. And like all other, for this story being brought to me. And it's such a moving story that, as I have repeatedly told Dhruba and others, that while I was doing it, I was, you can't help it. There were tears coming out, the way it has been described. And what was difficult is that it is in 4 languages. The narrative is in Assamese, there's Urdu, there's Hindi, there's Bangla, and a Bangla of the Bangla that is used in East Pakistan and Bangladesh. And there's also English, but which is often used in an ironical way. So how to put in all these things into one language? That was a challenge, but I really enjoyed doing it. And as with all other translations, the difference The difference is in, you are transferring the culture, but also, the language itself, the syntax. You will know that the syntax of English and the syntax of Assamese is almost diametrically, you are doing translation, so it's diametrically opposite, you can say, in many ways, so you have to be careful, otherwise it sounds stilted. And then of course the vocabulary is there, so many local terms, so many ethnic terms, these have to be put. But as I always say, English is a very flexible language. It accommodates many new words. The vocabulary can be, the nuanced vocabulary can even be created if it is not there, through a phrase or through a different kind of a word. So these challenges were there, and I really kind of, it was a very satisfying feeling for me to have done that. After that also, I have recently done, as you have mentioned, Lokinath Barua's short stories and so on, which was a different experience completely. And it was a very scary experience because he's an icon as well. Any kind of, that's the thing about translation. You want to put in your own inputs as a language. I mean, it's the language that you are basically focusing on. And on the other hand, you want to be true to the main writer as well. And I knew that if I got anything wrong with Lokinath Barua, I would have had it. So I have tried. I don't know. Let's see. It's just out. So let's see what happens.
Thank you so much, Mitra Vaidu.
Thank you.
I just want to add one more question because you are a vocalist, and my mother-in-law always mentions that you.
Yes, long ago.
How does music influence your work?
Yes, your mother-in-law, at that time I was singing a lot. These days I write about music. I don't really perform on stage. Music, I think, informs because music is, I always feel, the language of music and the language as we know it, they're different in two ways. I think for our language, whatever language, Assamese or English or whatever, it has to go via the mind, the brain. It has to. But music appeals directly to the heart. I mean, that may sound very simplistic and very over emotional or something, but for me that is the thing. Music, something that does not have language as we know it, it can be expressed through music. And music is also culture specific, but it is also universal. I may not know much about Japanese music, but I do know that I may not know the nuances, but I do know that this music is trying to express grandeur, grief, joy, whatever. I do not need to be educated in that. Whereas for literature, you need to be educated in that language. So I think music is much more universal. So that is why, music, and I feel music informs my work in different ways. I think, I need to get the rhythm right. The rhythm of the sentences, according to my own sense of perspective or whatever, I need to get, otherwise it may say the same thing, but if that word is not there, if that word is here, somehow that, tal, lay, loy, all of that, somehow it doesn't sound right to me, which is a very small thing, but for me it's quite, I need to go on. It's like OCD, I need to get that right. And also the fact that, this is of course a different thing. You're writing fiction, but somehow I always, some kind of music, some kind of songs, some kind of instrumental music somehow makes its way into all my fiction, which I think, I don't know how it comes, but I welcome that, because if it is a relevant thing, I like to put it in. So that is one of the things mainly. And music has taught me to be aware of the emotion, to be open to the emotion that comes when I listen to a good piece of music. So that is the main influence, I think.
I have a question for Dhruba. Yeah.
Yeah, Namrata, please.
Yeah. Dhruba, like in Boasting Winter, as well as in your other novel, we come across very, very loyal, like friends, like clinging to each other. So there is a sense of unification. You see, when we talk about human values, when we talk about ideals and ethics, we get to see that, actually feel that in your writings. Just like the extraneous layers were peeled off one by one, and we come across stark, bare human emotion, which is friendship, which is loyalty. So what is your take on that, Dhruba?
Namrata, uh, betrayal, loyalty, friendship, love, compassion, I think these are basically universal themes most writers attempt at. But I grew up in a situation where friendship did count a lot, not because we had some secrets that had to be kept only within us, or doing something extraordinary, that couldn't be shared universally. But it struck me that the human condition, if you look at the hunters, for example, right from the beginning, the caveman, to corporate secrets, to friendship in school, or when a girl falls in love with a boy or a boy with a girl, there is this sense of loyalty, the lack of betrayal that cements what we call individual humanity. The fact that we are actually humans, that we have an elevated understanding of life as compared to animals. We have that, and it had been with me for donkey's years. This thing, this understanding, feeling, and concept of loyalty, betrayal, friendship, and hence, because it was a part of my my growing up, my understanding of the human predicament, it came in unconditionally, it came in unconsciously when I created these characters. And character formation is pretty tough. The plot can be sometimes easy, but then to, at least for a person like me, like I said earlier, I'm still groping, trying to learn every day how to make it more strong, how to make it more effective, stronger, more acceptable to myself, and perhaps indirectly to the reader. So, Namrata, these emotions, these conditions, these human conditions, were actually, or are still a major part of my understanding of life. Even in office, I'm a former bureaucrat. I found that essentially, to be honest, uh, made things that much better and easier for me, that much easier for society, so that I could be a loyal servant, not a betrayer to the promises I made, to the oath I had taken. I think it's not only in this; it can be in your marriage, it can be in any situation. I mean, you're a professor yourself, you're a teacher. When you have students in front of you who lie to you, who are not true to their salt with their academic performance or with their ideal respect to you, it's a betrayal of sorts. And this eats into your psychology, into your psyche. And whatever eats into your psyche is actually something that generates a better character better character formation in fiction. Well, this is what I can say so far, Namrata. I mean, there's much more to it. It's not as maybe simple as the way I've said it. It differs from probably person to person. You're a poet. I've read your poems, marvel at them, and you'll probably acknowledge this much, that the sensitivity criterion for a writer, for a poet, comes from the essential true feelings he has for himself or she has for herself. If we try to imitate a sort of an emotion in which we are not strong and try to, put it on paper, I think we'll be falsifying ourselves. So to that extent, there are persons who are say for example, a person who's given to a lot of jealousy, I have a feeling that he'll be able to portray a character who's very jealous very effectively. So in that sense, no matter one keeps on rolling, one keeps on building up, and one keeps on learning. Thank you.
Thank you, Dhruba. Thank you so much. Kaushik, I have a very simple question for you. What is your advice for our new generation of writers writing in English from Assam?
Yeah.
Well, it's always difficult to provide advice for writers, because I think there's no rule book and there's no. I mean, it's not a career per se, and the craft. I mean, one learns intuitively and in an iterative manner. There's no rule book to the craft either. I think my advice would be, just, it may sound cliched and like well-worn advice that we've heard from other writers, but just to read very widely and to try and write every day, or as often as possible at least. I mean, something that I haven't been able to do the last few years, but I always try to. So I think it's to do that. It's to, I think in the current, I also feel, I'm thinking a lot about, like Dhruba, I'm learning and I'm trying to think of what my writing should look like. I mean, the next few books I'm working on 2 at the moment, and what they should look like. And I feel there might be a tendency to be sensationalist, to produce something that's just for the moment, because social media makes it seem like we need to trend. And there is this sort of, we are all in awe of momentary fame and celebrity. And I think one should resist that if one is serious as a writer. If one wants to be a social media influencer, and I mean, I have no reservations about that. If one wants to be that, then I mean, one should know that that is the career and not present something that's very contemporary and very snappy, let's say. I think in terms of readership, we will, there are enough readers who will read serious, in-depth, well-researched and well-considered books also. So to resist current and very contemporary trends, that would be my advice. Yeah, and to write as often as possible. As a writer, it's also, a third, I mean, we're still learning, so I don't think I'm even qualified to provide advice, really. I mean, I don't know. But a third that I've found useful is to know when to sort of display commitment to your project and when to step back and have a sense of perspective. That is, one should write the first draft in the throes of passion, so to say. But writing is not the process of writing, but it's actually, especially with longer works, writing is actually a process of editing and rewriting. I'm sure, Mitra and Dhruba, everyone would agree that, a lot of the real work happens after your first draft. So that's another thing to keep in mind, that it's a long journey and one needs to be open to redrafting and editing. It's difficult to know what one should retain and what one should drop after the first draft. One needs to take advice from good readers and writers, but also know which advice to ignore. Because sometimes, advice from a good writer may not actually resonate with the way you want your novel to shape up. So, but yeah, so write against the trend, be ready to edit and write as often as you can. I think I'd summarize with that.
Very well said.
Mukta, the floor is open for questions. Yeah. Many questions, I believe, and
many comments from,
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, Sujata Hati-Barua, she writes, great to know about the homework for the novel Windhorse. That's for Kaushik. And also,
I think we have a comment by Sanjay Hazaraka, sir.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah. If he's here, he can ask. Okay. We have no. We have 3 minutes to go. Participants, Do you have any query, suggestion, comment? Yeah, Mukuta, you go ahead.
Yeah, they are actually not suggestions, they are compliments actually. Thanks a lot, Mr. Kaushik. Can I ask a question in Hindi? Of course, Pragati, you can please go ahead. Let me unmute you. Pragati, yes, you can go ahead.
थैंक यू मैम।
Yeah.
यहाँ पे सभी आप सभी ने इतने अच्छे से हमें समझाया, नरेशन के बारे में बताया। मैं अग्रवाल महाविद्यालय से उपस्थित हूँ। तो मैं एक 3-4 प्रश्न है मेरे आप सभी से कि क्या जो अनुवाद होता है यानी ट्रांसलेटिंग जो होता है वो वर्ड्स टू वर्ड्स होता है या फिर उसके भावों को हम चेंज कर सकते हैं?
I think Mitra, Vaido, you can answer this. Yeah.
Sorry, what was that again? You can say in Hindi.
कि क्या अनुवाद जो है ट्रांसलेटिंग जो है वो
जी।
वर्ड टू वर्ड होता है या फिर उसके भावों में परिवर्तन लाके किया जा सकता है?
हाँ, may I answer in English? My Hindi is really bad.
Yeah. English में आप बता सकते हैं।
No, not word by word. It is, though I translate, I speak for myself, others will say differently. I do it line by line, but not word by word. And I try to not skip anything. You know, sometimes there's a long passage which you feel that, okay, it's maybe I should skip, but I do not skip because it's there for a purpose. I may think it's not necessary, but the author does. And then, of course, as Kaushik said, later on with editing, many things will be taken off or added and so on. But no, not word by word. Wo bhav, emotion, that has to come. And also the general thought process, that has to be taken into account. Word for word does not work. And also idiom to idiom does not work. Some idiom may be there in the in the source language, but if you try to translate that into something in the target language, it does not work. So all these things you have to tread very carefully.
एक और क्वेश्चन था कि एक ऐसा लेख या कहानी या फिर साहित्य कैसे लिखा जा सकता है जो एक व्यक्ति के मन पे एक चोट भी पहुंचाए और दूसरे व्यक्ति के मन पर कह सकते हैं कि सांत्वना दे सके, कि कह सकते हैं कि एक संवेदना व्यक्त करे, वो एक तरफ प्रहार करे और दूसरे तरफ उसको सांत्वना दे।
I think my other co-panelists can answer that.
Dhruba, Kaushik?
No,
Dhruba?
I think Kaushik will be a better option. Kaushik?
I think if I understood, sorry, मेरा भी हिंदी इतना अच्छा नहीं है since हमारा mother tongue नहीं है, but मुझे तो समझ में आया कि कोई ऐसा character जो थोड़ा आस्था भी दे और साथ में कुछ हानि भी करे, तो ऐसा कैरेक्टर बनाने में मतलब कैरेक्टर कैसे क्रिएट करते हैं, एज आई कैन आंसर कि ये स्पेसिफिकली हाउ यू कैन क्रिएट दिस कैरेक्टर, लेकिन कैरेक्टर क्रिएट करने के लिए आप जो पूछ रहे हैं ये तो बहुत कॉम्प्लेक्स या थोड़ा कॉन्ट्रडिक्शन वाला कैरेक्टर है। क्रिएट करने के लिए वन हैज टू थिंक ऑफ द मोटिवेशंस ऑफ द कैरेक्टर। आई मीन बहुत लंबी प्रोसेस है, but in brief, I mean, you think of the motivations, maybe you try to sort of first the motivations, what the character wants. ये मैंने कहीं पढ़ा था कि every character should want something. I mean, even if it's something simple, someone wants to have lunch, someone wants to change the world, but every character should want something. So what does he want and why does he or she act in this way? And उसके बाद there's also nowadays to create characters, I feel, especially in the last, I mean, this just, I'm not a student of literature, but I felt in the last 20, 30 years, novels have become more visual. and I try to keep that in mind also. I feel like we should think of how characters move and how they act in space. I mean, not just their internal world. And I think that's very important to readers nowadays, if one thinks of the reader, because the reader is so used to TV and movies. So I don't think very internal characters work with readers. And I mean, there's no rule, of course. Brilliant characters can be written without physical descriptions. And but there should be some sense of physicality to the character nowadays. And I mean, there are many other tricks. I mean, how to create a character takes years and lots of thinking. But these are, I mean, think of the motivation, think of how the character appears on the page and in a scene. Maybe if Dhruba wants to add something, or anyone else.
Well, Kaushik, yeah,
Mitra, go ahead. Dhruba, please go ahead.
Yes, Dhruba, yes.
Yeah, no, actually, listen, I'm a fan of Kaushik's. So, like, I had when I read Wind Horse, and we had when the book was launched, I remember asking. He had about 52 metaphors in the book. So I asked him, how did you get hold of all these metaphors? And I think character building is ultimately a metaphor about your own understanding of, about human beings or about whomsoever you're writing. And it, like I said, when you had asked me, Namrata, that the plot sometimes can be easy. But then character building is, that is where your imagination comes in. Filling in the dots, twisting it where it needs to be twisted, not twisting it when it ought not to be twisted, building up a person who's larger than life sometimes. I think about, some of the few books that have really affected me to kill. All of them have been by women writers, Black Beauty, To Kill a Mockingbird, Rebecca. These are, I can see you smiling, Namrata, but apart from
it's very interesting, Dhruba.
Yeah,
it's very interesting.
I've been influenced by women writers, and these are some of the seminal writers that have affected me. So when I think about Rebecca as a character, Daphne du Maurier's extraordinary lady, I think how did she do it? When I think about To Kill a Mockingbird, about Scout, the little 87-year-old girl, Harper Lee coming up with that kind of a character, Atticus, how did they go about it? So either it's something based on real life, which they've developed by adding or subtracting something. And I found that finally, maybe, I'm using the word maybe deliberately, it's the writer's imagination that really helps out in molding the kind of characters that he or she wants to develop. It takes, like Kaushik said, it takes years sometimes, and therefore it's not as easy as the way I have explained it or submitted to you, Namrata. Each writer, each author has its own tricks, his own modus operandi by which the character is built and developed. And only the writer who is powerful enough to perceive human nature, to see through certain things, can develop these characters and call them great characters or great books. So that's how it is, at least from my point of view, to that minimal extent.
Dhruba, I want to add to this.
Yeah,
this is an anecdote, an interesting turn of event in my life.
Okay.
Once, I, along with my students, we were exploring a dense jungle in the Garo Hills. And then one of my students told me that it seems like he's like Pranav, actually slowly creeping into the jungle. Like he was surrounded by the lush green canopies, the flora and fauna. So, and like Pranav, he became one with nature, plundering, going about, penetrating the jungle, exploring, discovering. So that's how fiction and your reality, they merge at times. And I am a big fan of you, Dhruba, just like you complimented Kaushik.
I'm very touched.
All right. Yeah.
We have,
thank you.
Yeah. We have a lot of questions. One question is for Mitra Vaido. This is from Gitika Talukdar. Mitra ma'am, when you translate authors like Baz Barua, who belong to a generation different from ours,
yes,
involve any technique or process to make it more relevant to the younger contemporary generation? and to someone who have no idea of the Assamese culture. So
right. Yes. So yes, thank you for that question. And that's always, again, a balancing one has to do. One is the language. The language, I feel a translator should always... Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah. So yeah, I feel it is a balance. I feel every book can be translated in different generations because the language always changes. So with Lokinath Barua, I used as contemporary a language as possible. There were some words in Assamese which are not so much used, which are not used these days. I resisted using archaic words in English. There were equivalents. I did not use them because I have been reading a lot of translations of Tagore, for instance, and the earlier translators now read in a very different way in English than contemporary translations. Contemporary translations speak to me in a way that earlier translations do not. So yes, I tried to use contemporary language in order to have relevance to myself as well as to the reader. And one thing was very good about translating Lokinath Barua, that he was much ahead of his times in his thinking, much ahead. In many, for instance, in the title story, Patmugi, he describes the feelings of a girl who was married briefly and who has been abandoned. And she needs to now, and this I thought for somebody writing 150 years ago, it is really amazing. And a man, that she needed that validation, that she's still a woman. She has been abandoned, but she needs that validation. So that validation, the story is about that. And I found that really resonated with me and I was amazed. So that difficulty I did not have, at least in the stories that I translated, that the relevance to contemporary times is very much there. But language, yes, I took some conscious decisions. So that was there. And I always try to get into the writer's style. I abandoned my own style and I try to get into the writer's style so that the feel, as far as possible, the feel of that writer can be translated into English as well. I hope that answers the question.
thank you, Mitra Vaido. We get a lot of compliments for Kaushik, Sanzaira, Preeti ma'am, Mitra Vaido. Very insightful session. And there is one, there's so many, okay. We have received a lot of international, registrations, and one person, I don't know, because she mentioned that she woke up around 4:30 a.m. because she lives in a different time zone, and she was very happy. Thank you so much for joining. And yeah.
There's one more message.
Yeah.
Yeah. Shall we wind up, Mukuta?
Yes, it was really delightful listening to you all, and thank you so much for coming. And we will actually invite you again, and most probably this time not through virtual mode. We'll invite you to my university. And thank you so much for joining. Please, Dhruba, Kaushik, Mitra, and dearest Preeti ma'am, thank you for your time and patience and for the encouragement, because, and please join us tomorrow as well.
Yes, yes.
Thank you.
Heartfelt gratitude from our side.
Yes.
It's a big learning experience for me. I learned a lot. I really learned a lot, and looking forward to listening to you again in another platform.
Yes.
And I apologize on behalf of the conveners and our universities. There were certain technical glitches in between. There were certain problem areas and loopholes. We apologize.
It is
Overall,
okay.
thank you so much. Our helpful gratitude to Preeti ma'am, Kaushik, Dhruba, Mitra Baido, and our participants and listeners and their cooperation is appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much.
Thank
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
Right.
Yeah,
Thank
we are
you.
leaving. Yeah, we are leaving the meeting.
Definitely.
Thank you.